The stories you are about to hear are true. Some names and locations have been changed at the author's discretion. Welcome to Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories.
An Air Force Ghost. First, let me say this story does not represent the opinion of the United States military in any way, nor does it reflect on any official military history. It's just my personal experience, along with some recollections that some folks that have served in the same maintenance shop as I was in. That disclaimer having been made, here we go. I'm a staff sergeant in the Air Force, serving at Nellis Air Force Base, Las Vegas, Nevada. I've been here nearly 10 years. I was initially assigned to the Jet Engine Intermediate Maintenance Facility, which is Building 858. I'm a jet engine mechanic. Building 858 is a mutt of a building, initially built in the mid-60s as a single hangar. Later they added a larger hangar behind the original, and then yet another hangar later. I don't know the full history of the building, of the things that may have happened in it, or of the site that it's built on. I do know from my personal experiences, though, that there were some strange things happening in it. My first experience with the ghost of 858 was in 1987. I was working swing shift, acting as the non-commissioned officer in charge of the newly formed 220 maintenance section. The other squadron we shared the building with had gone home, as had the other maintenance sections. I was alone in the building, waiting for the last F-15 and F-16 sorties to come down for the night. I can't recall the exact times, but it was between 0000 and 0100. I was sitting at a desk in the office, in front of an open doorway that faced out into our maintenance bay. The bay is approximately 40 feet wide, 100 feet deep, and about 2.5 stories tall at the top of the peak roof. From my desk, I could look out the door and see almost wall-to-wall along the width of the building, and as the office was against the end of the bay, I could also see the entire length of the bay. I was reading a book when suddenly I heard footsteps. I was expecting the CRS expediter to come in, so I immediately thought it was him entering the bay, but I didn't hear the fire doors open. I looked up and could see no one in the bay. Leaving my office, I stepped out and called out and got no response. Shrugging off the incident, I returned to my desk and my book. And then, through the peripheral vision above the book, it's kind of hard to explain what I mean. You're reading and you see stuff above the top of the book. You get what I'm saying, I guess. I saw someone walking across the width of the bay. I looked up and saw no one. Now I started to get the chills. Going back to my book, I heard the footsteps again, and also see the person walking the bay once more. Looking up, though, again, there is no one there. I get up, walk a security check around the bay, find no doors unsecure, and just nobody's there. I get that spooky feeling, though, that I am being watched. Shortly after this, the CRS expediter comes in, the fire doors banging as usual when he enters the building. These doors are the only entrance to the bay after hours. I convince him to walk a security check with me through the facility. We find no doors open, and there's no one else in the facility. I mention this to a friend of mine the next day, and he replies that it isn't unusual to hear footsteps in the bay. He's had the same experience, numerous times, as well as seeing the figure that I saw. Next to the 220 bay was the J85 bay. This bay ran the same length and width as the 220 bay, with a ceiling-to-floor wall dividing them. At the south end of the J85 bay was a roll-up fire door that led into a warren of offices. The hallway that fed those offices was wood-paneled, about 30 feet long, and the walls were, maybe 7 feet high, leaving the tops of the offices open to the roof of the building. The J85 bay and the 220 bay were joined by a double fire door at the middle of their length. On security check one evening, prior to shutting down for the night, I stepped through the double doors to make sure the 85 bay was secure. I moved towards the hallway at the south end of the bay. All bay lighting was off, except for the emergency overheads, which were always on in case of power failures or for anyone who needed to enter the building. As I prepared to move down the hallway, I could see that something appeared to be on the southern wall where the hall kind of made an L shape to the east to join the break room. It appeared to just be a gray mass of dim light, floating approximately 5 feet off the ground. Looking at it, it appeared to be slowly roiling upon itself. It's hard to explain. It was dim, and to the best of my memory, it was casting no light upon the ground. The hallway and office warren had no lights on, and no emergency lighting was active in that section. I stepped about 2 paces into the hall to investigate, when all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I got goosebumps, and something inside of me said that going down there would be a major mistake. So, rather than stay and investigate, or have this thing approach and investigate me, I turned and made a hasty retreat. Ran like bat out of hell back to the full lighting of the 220 bay. I brought up this experience later on with another coworker from the other squadron, and he told me of an experience that he had in the break room, that place where the L hallway kind of led to. He had stepped in there a month prior to my experience to just grab a soda. The double fire doors between the break room and the hallway were closed and latched. The lighting in the break room was off, the only illumination being from the soda machine and the candy machine. As he stepped into the room to go to the machines, he noticed a light in the cracks of the fire doors. Unlike mine, his was a bright light, as bright as a jet light being held to the cracks. For those who don't know, a jet light is a work light made from an automobile headlight and powered by wall current that runs through a transformer, and that gives you an idea of how bright this light was. The light was at the crack of the middle doors, halfway off the floor. It moved up to the crack at the top, moved slightly right and to the left, then back down. It moved to the crack at the floor and again moved left and right before returning to the middle crack, halfway off the floor. This guy said that the movement took approximately a minute and a half. He reached for the door, expecting to expose a coworker at a prank, but as he touched the door, the light dimmed and stopped moving. Jet lights don't dim, they just go out completely, and like me, he got an immediate reaction from the hair on the back of his neck and the goosebumps. He turned his head and beat a hasty retreat back to his maintenance crew. Several of us have had various experiences in the building, and we were sitting around one night relating them to one another. People have seen lights floating in the dark and try to explain them away as brake lights from a passing car, despite the fact that the only window in the bay was 1 foot by 1 foot and 15 feet below from where the lights were being seen. People have seen figures walking through the bays, hearing footsteps when they were all alone. Doors slam in the maintenance bays at odd hours, equipment gets moved around, and 2-ton cable hoists are seen swinging when there's no one there to be moving them. Brad and I were teased by our supervisor regarding this stuff. We were working in the 85 bay one evening, and she came down the hallway going, "Woo, woo, hey guys, I'm talking to the ghosts." And we told her not to fool around. No telling who might be listening. We then closed our toolboxes and left through the doors in the common wall. As we were turning in our equipment, she came running up another hallway that joined 2 of the hangars. She was yelling at us, demanding to know how we did what we did, indignant that we tried to scare her. Seems that after we left, she went to shut off the overhead lights in the bay. As she hit the switches on the east side, she looked up at a light that hadn't gone out, but was quite dim. She then realized that it wasn't one of the overhead lights, but something, that's all she could say, and assumed it was a prank that Brad and I were pulling. As she took a few steps towards the light, which was approximately 20 feet off the ground, it suddenly dropped and began moving towards her. She then panicked, as both Brad and I had done, and ran down the southern hallway, through the break room, down another maintenance bay, through the adjoining hallway, and up to where he and I were inventorying our tools. She was attempting to hide her fear with indignation, but was failing miserably. When she asked us to go investigate what it was, we refused. She then jokingly ordered us to do it. Again, we refused, explaining that if she was going to order us to do something, she'd have to be willing to do it herself, at which point she refused. When we later explained what had happened to the master sergeant in charge of the shift, he also refused to go to the 85 bay to take a look, saying he'd rather do it in daylight. It seems, from talking one-on-one with him later, that he'd had several experiences in the bays as well, but vehemently refused to talk about them. I don't know what was going on in either one of those bays, but I'll never forget it to this day, and it sure was creepy at the time. My aunt and the black-eyed children. My Aunt Polly lives alone on a hill tucked into a dense forest, not too far from my parents' house. I've been to see her lots of times because she lives so close. I was sure she got pretty lonely as she lived on her own, so I made it a point to see her often. Polly always struck me as kinda kooky, which is totally fine. She talks to her pet cat a lot, watches weird TV shows, and she talks sometimes about how she goes to see mystics and fortune tellers, but I figure most of what she does is out of boredom. As I said, she's single. She's in her late 40s and has to make her own fun. Recently, my family invited her to dinner because I'm going to college soon. I hadn't seen her in a while, not since before my own incident with a black-eyed child, and while eating, I considered bringing it up. I knew it would be weird, but I was interested to see if Polly had ever dealt with anything like what I was about to tell her in her life. And it wasn't out of the question. My dad had had a run-in with a black-eyed child, too. "Something weird happened to me recently," I said. My mom, who also knows about what happened, and my dad gave me looks like they were unsure if that's the kind of thing they wanted to be discussing at dinner. They both knew what I was getting at. I told Aunt Polly the whole story, and she was silent through all of it. She just chewed thoughtfully. "I still don't even know what was with that kid," I finished. "That's certainly pretty spooky," she remarked, and that seemed like the end of it. but she appeared a little bit estranged, and after dinner she told me her story. Mom went to do the dishes, and Dad had to go upstairs to do some work stuff on his computer, so I sat with Polly to watch TV. "I have a story just like that," she said. I looked over to where she was sitting and realized she wasn't paying any attention to Jeopardy. She was looking at me, and had been for who knows how long. "You do?" I asked. "Yes. It happened a while ago. I never really told anybody because I didn't know what to make of it. This is what Aunt Polly said happened. It was early September 2012, and she was up late watching a movie with her cat Chelsea. Chelsea is fat and snuggles people like she's a lapdog, so when Chelsea's hair stood up and she suddenly slinked off Polly's lap, Polly didn't know what to think. This is her story from her point of view. I'd fed her and she was acting the same as always. She just got up and left all of a sudden, looking like I'd offended her or something. Polly had remained on the couch for several minutes until she heard some mewing coming from the laundry room. She found Chelsea in between the washer and dryer, shaking miserably and refusing to come out. Polly's arm was reaching into the gap to try to fetch Chelsea when there were several knocks on her door. Halloween was a couple of nights before, so I thought maybe it was just a few people doing some late trick-or-treating or something. I don't know, I wasn't thinking clearly. I just grabbed a bowl of candy and went to the door. Polly opened it wide and was met with 2 children, a boy and a girl. "Happy Halloween," she said. But the kids weren't dressed up or holding buckets or anything. They just both stood there, looking into her house. "The girl was shifting uneasily, peering around me and sizing up my house," said Polly. I asked if they were okay.
"Did the cat go away?"
the boy asked, lifting his voice. Polly said it sounded fake and wrong. "Excuse me, what?"
"There aren't any others around here,"
the boy said to no one in particular, and then he smiled.
"Telephone."
At this point, Polly said she was kind of scared and asked if they needed to use her phone.
"We need to call them."
Polly was about to go inside and call somebody when the girl, who hadn't spoken a word, tugged at her pants. She stooped to her level, and she spoke quietly into her ear, and sounded absolutely terrified.
"We need to get inside, Polly."
Polly froze, and the young boy turned to stare into her eyes and grin unrealistically, and almost unnaturally. Polly said his eyes were undoubtedly completely black. Polly said she stood up, went inside, and shut the door very quickly. She locked it up and secured the rest of the house as pounding sounded from her foyer. Someone was frantically drumming on her door and yelling, but Polly said the voice was neither the girls nor the boys. She called the cops, who arrived almost a half an hour later. All they found were footprints that led into the forest behind Polly's home, and they chalked it up to a freak occurrence and said they'd check with people in the neighborhood and with any local missing children reports. Nothing turned up, and Polly did not hear from the police again. However, she did say she found footprints circling her house for months afterwards, and found evidence of a makeshift bed in her gardening shed. A really creepy old man. This happened when I was around 13. I was quite a tomboy back then and had a huge collection of Nerf guns. Although I did have girlfriends too, my friends were mainly guys who also had collections which rivaled mine. My gang consisted of about 5 people. One day my friends and I, being the kids we were, decided to organize a Nerf war held at our local park. It wasn't the typical big open green space though, it was more of a forest. As we were in Australia, the park was filled with big gum trees to hide behind and had a long creek running down in the middle of it. Perfect conditions for a Nerf war. We set the date, and one of my best friends said he would bring a bunch of his friends over so we would have bigger teams. This meant that we would have about 4 people on each side, so we agreed to him bringing more people, and each decided on who would be in what team. By the time the chosen Saturday rolled around, we were all ready and kitted up for the fight. I, like everyone else, had brought most of my Nerf guns, along with which we then shared amongst our friends. Some of us even brought walkie-talkies and other gadgets. To onlookers, we probably looked silly, but we didn't care. I guess the excitement in being with friends forced back my usual shy nature. Anyway, after everyone arrived, we worked on our bases and began the war. All was going well until about an hour into it. I was sitting alone at our team's makeshift base. My main weapon had jammed and I was trying to fix it by poking sticks into the barrel and repeatedly pressing the trigger, all to no avail. The others in my team were off scouting through the woods. All I could hear were Nerf blasters until an unsettling whistling came from behind me. I heard footsteps on the dried leaves getting closer and closer. At first I assumed it was one of my teammates playing a joke on me, so I just kept working on my gun with my back against the tree we had built our base around. Then I saw him. His face still haunts me to this day. A tall old man, probably in his 60s, walked by me in unwashed clothes. He was swinging a gray plastic shopping bag, which looked as though it was filled with mud or dried blood. I couldn't tell which one, though. Maybe he was carrying both. He noticed me and stopped walking, and was standing about 15 feet away. His eyes widened as he looked over me, and continued whistling some old tune. I remember feeling terrified as I was alone with nothing but a jammed Nerf gun for protection. I thought if I kept ignoring him and just working on my gun, he would go away, but he didn't. He kept staring. My thoughts turned to making a plan of action. He didn't look like he could outrun me, but I still felt too terrified to move. Instead, I reached for my phone and dialed my mom, still not meeting his uncomfortable gaze. I then held the phone up to my ear and tried to appear as though I hadn't even noticed him. It rang a few times before I flinched as I didn't hear my mom's voice. I heard his. He had stopped the whistling and was speaking to me in this raspy voice.
"Come and play with me, little girl,"
he told me as he started to swing the bag once more. Our eyes finally met just as my mom answered the phone. I whispered to her that there was a strange man trying to talk to me while I could feel myself tearing up. Even now, I can't forget the way he was staring at me. It was like an animal who had just sighted its prey. My mom was furiously trying to tell me to calm down and that she couldn't understand me. He finally stopped staring when one of my team members called out to me saying their gun was broken too. It was my younger sister, whom my mom had forced me to bring along. The man turned away from me and started towards her voice, and I was begging for my mom to come and find us, and that the man was now after my sister, who was only 9. She told me to go find my sister and everyone else who was out here. I was so scared, but I managed to find the courage to run off into the woods and round everyone up. Thankfully, my sister hadn't run into the man yet. I told the others straight away everything that happened, to which only one of them had also seen him walking in the woods. He said that the man was walking quickly, almost running, and that he thought it was odd, but nothing more than that at the time. We all went home after that incident, and some of my friends were annoyed that the fun had to be cut short, but others wanted, as equally as badly as me, to just get the hell out of there. So, scary old man with the bag full of mud and blood, thanks for scaring us and ruining our day. The entity in the church. The story I'm going to tell you happened to me when I was a freshman in high school and changed how I viewed the world. I was with my youth group leader and 3 of my good friends from school. We had just finished our youth group meeting and we had gone downstairs to the kitchen and eating area. We went into the kitchen to eat some snacks that were left and we just started discussing the end of the world. We were talking about how when Jesus came back that Satan would be tossed in his own fiery pit. As my youth minister said this, my friend, who was very level-headed and not one to freak out over anything, went deathly pale and started to shake. We noticed this right away and asked what was wrong. She said, "Can't you hear that woman screaming?" We all looked at each other, and I was about to say no when I heard it. I heard this lady screaming a high, ear-splitting scream as if she were in pain. I looked around and could tell the others had heard it too. I started to think that it had to be something other than what I thought it was, and asked if it could be kids outside in the park or some kind of cat. It probably wasn't people or cats, since it was around 9:30 at night. Also, you need to know that the town I lived in is a very small farm town of just over 2,000 people, so tons of kids outside at this time of night is not very normal. We all headed out to see if we could see what was causing the noise. As we looked around, we saw no people or animals anywhere around the church, and as we again entered the kitchen, we heard the scream again. My other friend started to cry and started rocking back and forth. As I turned to her, the entire kitchen seemed to turn blood red, and I heard another scream. We all left the kitchen at the same time to enter the big fellowship hall where the tables were set up to eat meals and have youth group. And there is a hallway that is to the right of the kitchen door that leads to 2 bathrooms and the back entrance of the basement. As we exited the kitchen, we all immediately looked into the pitch-black hall at the same time. I could just feel that there was something there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel pure hate coming from something, and I could tell it wanted to do us harm. My youth minister asked if we felt it all as well, and we said yeah, we did. I started to get bone cold and started to hyperventilate and shake all over. My youth minister told us all to hold hands and started to pray. I prayed for strength and wisdom on what to do. And as I did that, a wave of peace rolled over me, starting at my head and flowing down my body. As that happened, we all started to pray out loud, and that the entity had no power here. Soon the feelings went away. We kept praying and the feeling of evil just took off. After that day, I realized that there are such things as demonic entities, and I don't mess around with Ouija boards or watch movies like The Exorcist. I have told this story to a handful of people just to warn them of the danger of messing with things that are unseen. In my mind, I'm better off just praying, and I believe everyone else is too. The last time I'll use Craigslist to date. So, a little background. I'm 31, female and a single mom. I posted an ad on Craigslist in the strictly platonic relationship section, as I'm not looking for a serious relationship, but just a cool guy to spend some time with and go from there. First off, I'm not at all a slut, just looking for hookups. I had tried other dating sites, but I wasn't getting anywhere. Secondly, the Craigslist in my area is a lot more tame than most cities, and I felt safe using it with a fake email address and a fake name attached. Anyway, after placing my ad, I got about 20 replies or so. I could quickly narrow down my choices by eliminating people who clearly didn't read my entire ad, were too old, or just didn't make any kind of sense in their reply. By the end, I had 3 guys I was talking to, soon down to just 2 that seemed interesting and safe. Well, sort of safe anyway. Guy number 1, we'll call him Chris, is super cool, laid back, easy to talk to, and I'm actually good friends with him now, although we didn't really develop into anything close to what I was looking for. Guy number 2, we'll call him Jay. He seemed pretty nice. He was a little older than I was looking for, and I didn't like the picture he sent me. He looked kinda creepy. Dark eye bags, dark eyes, and grayish, tired-looking skin, but I'm not one to judge by looks alone, so I gave him a chance. Jay and I texted every day for about a week. He texted way faster than me and more often. 2, 3, 4 texts back to back. It was overwhelming for me, and he was almost always went from "what kind of music do you like" to "what kind of panties do you wear?" in just 2 texts or less. Of course, I didn't answer the ones I felt were too personal. After a week, I agreed to actually talk to him over the phone, even though at this point I was a little bit creeped out by him and was really getting along better with Chris. So he calls and I hear his voice. Immediately, I get goosebumps, and not the good kind. His voice was higher pitched than I expected, and I can hear the excitement in it. It's hard to describe, but he sounded too loud, and the way he put his sentences together, it was just a weird flow. I, of course, was polite and mostly just listened to him talk. He revealed that he was in an unhappy marriage and had 2 kids, one of which was severely autistic and really hard to manage. He also said that he had some type of anger issues that he takes medication for. Okay, my creep factor shot up to 1,000. I just had the feeling the whole time that I needed to hang up on this guy, change my number, move to another town, hell, move to another country. But I remained polite and cut the conversation short without seeming too desperate to get away. Just something about hearing his voice sent me into an emergency abort mode. I did not attempt to text or call him, and I didn't answer any more of his. I ghosted him, I guess you could say. After a week or so, I forgot about him for the most part. Chris and I were still hitting it off, and I was busy with life anyway. Fast forward about a month and a half, and I see a mugshot on the local news. Jay was arrested for soliciting a minor. A detective posing as a 12-year-old girl had been talking to him for the past month online. Jay had posted his own ad on Craigslist and apparently didn't mind talking to a child. He sent nudes to the undercover cop, and he was caught when they set up a place to meet to make babies. Yeah, he is quoted as having said that via text. Man, that's gross. Jay was not only just a creep, he was a super make-your-skin-crawl creep. Thank God I listened to my intuition and cut off our conversation when I did. The thought of him turns my stomach. And because of him, I will never use Craigslist to find a date ever again. A Seance Spirit. My story happened just a little over 20 years ago when I was a young teenager. My parents had built a new house in a newly developed area of town 3 years prior, and my best friend lived across the road at the time. One day we were just sitting around my bedroom with another girlfriend when she suggested we have a seance. I will call my best friend Jane and my other teenage friend Noni to help with the story. Those aren't their real names, but I don't want their identities to be revealed. Neither Noni nor myself had ever done this before, so we let Jane take control of the situation. She made a mock Ouija board out of drawn letters on paper and used a small clear drinking glass as a planchette. She instructed our friend and myself to place a finger on the glass with hers so we could begin. It wasn't long before a spirit was in contact with us and the glass began moving. Noni and myself thought Jane must have been tricking us, but when Jane took her finger away, the glass kept moving around on my bedside table. Noni and myself swore that neither of us was moving it. I can only recall the first spirit's surname being Barch, and he told us that he had been murdered. This didn't seem to faze us much, and we proceeded to ask him girly questions concerning a friendship group we had had at school. We asked him who was going to leave the group first, and so on. Then he proceeded to spell out names in order. We spoke to 2 other spirits that night, but the details are too fuzzy to remember. After all, it was 20 years ago, and I didn't think too much of it after that day, and really, not until now. As school life continued, I did notice that girlfriends left the group in the order that Barch said they would. At the time, I put it down to just pure coincidence. Some strange unexplained things did start to occur in my home afterwards, especially in my bedroom. I recall complaining to my father about a scratching noise that I would often hear in the corner of my room up by the ceiling. One day he went into the attic to investigate and even placed some rat poison up there, but he never did see any sign of a living animal. The noise was especially apparent at nighttime, and it would last for about an hour at a time. Another time, while my family was in the living room, we heard a loud crash coming from the kitchen. When we went to have a look, we found a broken glass shattered on the top bench. Then, when I was 16, my youngest brother was born, and my parents decided to build 2 more rooms onto the back of the house. My oldest brother and I later moved into these rooms, and my baby brother took my old bedroom. When my baby brother started waking and crying nonstop every night, my parents would end up placing him in their bed. My mother tried the controlled crying method, but nothing worked. My brother did not want to stay in his room. Eventually, my parents gave in for the sake of getting some sleep and let him sleep in there. My father, on the other hand, could not sleep, and his bed would eventually become the single bed that was still in my old bedroom. One morning as I was getting ready for school, my father asked me if I had felt the earthquake the night before. I was puzzled and asked him what, and he proceeded to tell me how in the early hours of the morning he woke to feel the bed shaking violently. As he sat up in bed, the shaking subsided and then stopped. He had brushed it off as an earthquake and went back to sleep. We listened to the radio and TV that morning for any news of the earthquake, but there was nothing. Another morning he asked me what I was trying to tell him in the early hours of the morning, thinking I had stopped to talk to him on the way to the bathroom. And I told him I never went to the bathroom that morning. He was puzzled because he swore he had heard a female voice talking to him and thought it was me. There was something that happened to my father in that bedroom that he never told me, but my grandmother did. She informed me only last year how one night my father had seen a dark figure standing in the corner of that bedroom. It had really frightened him, and I guess he didn't want to frighten any of us by telling us at the time. My parents went on to sell that house 2 years after I finished high school, and has since had a couple of more owners. A clairvoyant told me last year I had unleashed 3 unpleasant spirits in that bedroom, and that they were all still likely there. Last year I brought it up in conversation with my father, the strange occurrences in that bedroom, and what the clairvoyant had said about it. I told him for the first time that I once held a seance in that bedroom. I didn't think he would believe in that kind of thing, but I guess the experiences must have left a lasting impression, because he answered me, "Well, that explains a lot." A strange creature in Connecticut. This is a story told to me by my mother. She was around 15 years old at the time when this happened. Growing up in a small rural Connecticut town in the early 70s, there were a lot of woods and not a lot of things to do, so sleepovers were all the rage for teenage girls. This particular night, my mom was dropped off at her friend's house. Her friend, who I'll call Jan, lived in a small farmhouse tucked back into the woods away from the main road and far away from any other neighbors. The house was white and had a porch that, instead of being on the front, was attached to the back of the house, facing the backyard in the woods. The last bit of information I'll give before starting the story is the door. Being a farmhouse, the door that led into the side of the house had a gap under it about 9 inches. In the winter, a block would be placed under it to keep the cold out. This encounter happened in the spring, so the block had been removed. Now, on to the story. It was a Saturday night, and my mom had been dropped off at Jan's house. Jan's parents had gone out for the evening, leaving the girls alone. For the first part of the night, my mom and Jan did the normal sleepover things like gossip and do each other's hair. At around 9:30, they decided to watch a little TV in the living room. Suddenly, they heard the porch creak as if something heavy had climbed onto it. Both girls stared at each other and listened as whatever it was started walking around the porch very slowly. "Maybe it's Tom," Jan asked. Tom was her older brother, who was supposed to be out with his friends, but he wasn't above playing practical jokes on his younger sibling. My mom rolled her eyes, stood up, and walked over to the back door. She flipped the light on and went to pull the curtain back to peer outside when they both heard whatever it was jump off the porch. My mom peered into the darkness past where the light reached and saw a figure dart into the woods. She replaced the curtain, left the light on, and went back to Jan. "Whoever it was is gone now," she said. "It probably was Tom." Jan nodded and they went back to watching TV, still a little unnerved. They had just started to relax when a shadow passed by the back door and the porch creaked again. Whatever it was, or whoever it was back. They listened as whatever it was walked slowly across the porch, heading towards the side of the house. They also heard what sounded like nails being dragged against the side of the house, and both girls were terrified. Whatever it was made it to the end of the porch and was now heading to the side door. For a few minutes there was silence. My mom and Jan looked towards the side door. Maybe it was Tom. Suddenly a hand was thrust under the gap in the door. It was covered in a reddish-brown fur, the fingers longer than any human fingers, and it had jagged black claws. It used its claws to scratch at the bottom of the door, and both girls screamed. There was a strange grunt from outside the door, and the hand was pulled back, and they could once again hear the creature run away. Still screaming, Jan grabbed the door block and shoved it under the door. She grabbed a knife from the kitchen, and both girls sat huddled behind the couch until Jan's parents came home. Her parents were greeted by two terrified teenagers, and my mom begged to be taken home. Of course, no one believed them. Tom was blamed and yelled at when he arrived home the next day, but my mom maintains to this day that she knows what she saw and heard, and that was not a human hand. She didn't think it was Tom. A haunted Irish road. This story took place when I was a much younger man. In the late 1980s, my friends and I would travel each summer to the beautiful Wicklow Hills just outside of Dublin for a week of hiking. Certain parts of the hills are still quite remote. On this occasion, we were staying at a youth hostel in the valley. It was a small 2-level whitewashed brick house with no running water and no electricity. The hostel is to this day the only complete structure in the glen. The glen itself has a history going back to the 1500s, when it was the stronghold of the Gabhail Ragnall branch of the O'Byrne clan. In 1580, it was the site of the Battle of Glenmalure, when 800 English soldiers were cut down by Irish rebels. None of my friends and I knew this at the time. Like all rural areas of the world where one is away from the lights of progress and civilization, night in the valley is, and I'm sure that still is, very, very dark, with the late hours filled with just stars and little else. Well, so we believed at the time. There were 7 of us on this particular trip. Ian, Lenny, JP, Des, Will, Adrian, and me. It was our final stop before we headed home. We had already spent a few days at another hostel, and Ian, Des, and I had made our way to Glenmalure by trekking over the 3,000-foot Luganakila, while the others had taken the safe and sensible route by road. Maybe it was the difficulty of hiking over the boggy, misty highlands that added to our experience that night. And then again, maybe not. After we arrived in the late evening of our first day in the glen, we decided to explore the area. To this day, only one road leads in and out of the valley, and all along its length, sandy gravel crunches underfoot. We were messing around, joking about geeky things, and had split into 2 groups. The road group and the mountain group. Ian, Des, and I made our way up the mountain, and we walked a good 15 meters behind the others. We were trying to freak them out, shouting that we could see people in the thick woods to the right of the road, throwing pebbles at them, and so on. Suddenly, we heard footsteps behind us. At first we figured it was just somebody else from the hostel, likewise out for a walk in the country air, so we cooled off on the foolishness. And the person behind us was walking fast, and we thought they would soon overtake us. And they did. Well, the footsteps did, but we didn't see anybody going with them. And we also noticed that there were the footsteps of more than one person, but all walking in time so as to sound like only one. As the sound of the footfalls passed me and my group, we all froze. A chilly breeze traveled with the sound, odd and out of place in the humid summer night. I remember how the hair on my neck stood up. None of us looked at each other. I remember that quite strongly. We all stared at our friends, and they continued to walk ahead of us, with the footsteps about to catch up to them. I know it was only seconds, maybe 5, 10, but time just seemed to stretch. Then Ian, in a half-giggle, half-moan, said, "Fuck this," and turned and ran. Des and I followed very quickly. We ran back to the hostel, and I risked a look back over my shoulder at my friends, only to see them looking back at us, confused at our odd behavior, while behind them I saw 3 vaguish bluish outlines, human-shaped, walking steadily away down the road. Though I didn't experience it, Ian swears that when he looked back too, he also saw the 3 figures, and he had heard other things. He heard the figures singing in time like soldiers do on a march, and from the woods he claims he heard taunts which sounded like they were in Gaelic, although not the Gaelic we all learned in school. I asked him what he thought was being said. "I have no idea," he replied, "but the voices in the woods, the Gaelic voices were sinister. The voices on the road were frightened. They were very, very scared. I have not been back to that road since." The creatures in my room. I've had a few experiences that have left me feeling a little crazy, and I've analyzed them to the point that I often wonder if they even happened at all. My most notable experience was in 1993. I was 17 and had just started my senior year at a new high school. A quick side note that doesn't really pertain to the story, but it was a very traumatic year following this incident I'm about to tell you about, including the deaths of some friends, some drug abuse, rape, etc., etc. It was just an all-around very, very bad year. This night, however, was an average night. Nothing out of the ordinary. If I remember correctly, I had done my homework, eaten some pizza, and went to bed around 11 o'clock. I was not quite asleep yet, just trying to quiet down my brain so I could fade off into dreamland, when I suddenly heard the most terrifying growls and snarls all around me in my room. My eyes were closed, and I knew I wasn't asleep, but I couldn't move, and I was sure whatever creatures were in my room would devour me at any moment. I say creatures because there is no animal on Earth that could make a sound as horrible as what I heard. And these creatures seemed to be like an entire pack in my room. Now, I am not, and was not then, a religious person. However, because I didn't know what else to do, I stumbled through a prayer in my head that went something like, God, I'm sorry I don't talk to you very often or praise you as I guess I should, but please help me now. And, as him as my witness, I suddenly felt like my body, but not my physically body, mind you, if that makes any sense, was starting to float. Everything went quiet. No more growls, and I was floating away. No bright lights or anything, but at that moment I was convinced I was dying. My eyes were open then, but it was complete darkness, which terrified me, and I immediately thought, oh my God, I've gone blind to boot. Scared to death, I screamed, and everything stopped. I ran like a mad woman to my mother's room, screaming at her that I had just died, but for some reason had come back to life. God, my poor mother and the look on her face. In a sleepy haze, my mother managed to reassure me that I was fine, and that the pizza we ate earlier must have been drugged. Wow, that was some great pizza. Needless to say, I was scared, puzzled, and convinced I had either died or was going mad, and I continued to bring the incident up with my mother. My mother, unlike me, was very religious, so she asked her priest if he would talk to me about the bad dream that I had had. So here's me and this priest, which just weirded me out even more, sitting in my room as I try to explain to him what had happened, and I was convinced that once he left me, he would call the authorities and have me committed. But no, he proceeded to tell me that he had had a similar incident in seminary school, and this was heaven and hell fighting over my soul. Oh, glory. Now I think we're all nuts. I don't know what that was. A very, very bad and very real nightmare? However, I was awake. Was it a drugged pizza slice like my mom said? Was it a glimpse at my future tortured year, heaven and hell playing chess in my room before I knew what was going to happen to me? I don't know, but it scared me to death. Literally or not, you decide. And I hope never, ever to experience it again. A few other minor things have happened to me. I've heard my name called when I was alone. I've seen black shadowy figures in a corner of a room that sent me running out of the house. Everyone else in the house manages to sleep through it, just plain odd. And that feeling that someone is near, and the hair on the back of your neck is standing up tall, but alas you're alone, will never leave me. Maybe we're not really alone. I can't be alone in the dark. As I write this at the beginning, I have to make sure that my wife, 2 cats, and one of my best friends are in the same room as me, and the lights are on. Some background on myself. I'm a 23-year-old transgender male, and to keep everyone's privacy, I will be changing names. I've always been sensitive to the paranormal, even as a young child. An example is when, a year after my mother left my father, I was about 1.5 years old, and we were living in a place called Farmersville, California. My mother would wake up every night to me screaming like someone was shaking me. We later found out that, right where my room was, developers had found a skeleton of a toddler crammed into an old orange crate while they were tearing out the old orange groves to make the apartments that we lived in. I have many other stories, but this was the one that I'm going to be going in depth to. It's the one which haunts my memories. Some more info. My mother's been married 3 times. My father, who ended up being an alcoholic, was her first marriage, and my sister's father was the second. And for future reference, this takes place during my mother's second marriage to a bastard that I'm calling Dave. Now, seeing as where he grew up, I can understand slightly why he was such an abusive waste of human life, along with his fucked up mother, but that's not really the point of this story. It was around 2001 when my sister was born. I was about 8. Her father wanted to be closer to his family in Los Angeles, but didn't want to shell out for an apartment, much to my mother's dismay, and mine. So we ended up moving in with his parents. His mother did not like me at all, but his father was very kind, and sadly there was a language barrier. They spoke Spanish, and I spoke English and no Spanish, but he was very nice to me. I was a quiet, shy kid who went out of my way to keep out of trouble, so there was no real reason for the hostility from this woman. This guy's mother thought it would be detrimental to my mother's marriage to sleep with her in the bed, so I was banished to a small couch in the living room. I hated this house with a passion. It was long and raised up off the ground. It looked like it was 2 stories tall, but there was only one level. It was also about 30 yards away from a very active railroad, which operated at all hours of the night and day, and the trains shook the house very hard when they went by. The house was built oddly to where there were 3 bedrooms, an office, and 1 bathroom. My sister's uncle would crash there often, so the 3rd bedroom was reserved for him and his kids only. The odd part was that the front door was the office, then it would go into the living room, where I slept alone on that couch, and at the far end was where my sister's grandfather slept at night in a hospital bed. He had a degenerative condition, though no one told me what it was. Next to that would be my sister's grandmother's room, and the only way to get to the bathroom. The bathroom was long and narrow, in which the door was in the grandmother's room. The shower was by the door, the toilet and sink and light switch were on the far side. The really weird thing was that there was a latch at the top of the door in the grandmother's bedroom, making it be able to be locked from the outside. Then past the grandmother's room was the door to the kitchen and the 2 other bedrooms. The back door led out to a small cement backyard with 9-foot-tall fences, which I hated going into. Now that you have the layout of the house, it should be easier for you to understand the story. We moved in a few weeks before Halloween and all was well. Everyone was civil at the time. It took some getting used to sleeping without my mother close by, and I would wake up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was in the room, but I would just brush it off as someone checking in on me. As Halloween approached, it became clear that the grandmother had ill will towards me, constantly nitpicking at everything I did, such as forgetting to make me a plate at mealtimes, and my mother would have to split her meal with me. She did everything to try to convince me that she could keep me away from my baby sister, saying that I would hurt her, and keeping the other grandkids away from me because I was bad news and not blood-related. She would yell at me for little stuff like not using the communal spit cup in the bathroom while brushing my teeth. It was like a school bully parading around as a grandmother. She wouldn't do this when my mom was around, but unfortunately my mother worked as a nurse at a hospital a few towns over, so she wasn't home all that much. Halloween rolled by, and from one of the huge parties my sister's side of the family throws every year, we got a motion-activated scream prop, which was a head and 2 hands and a string that would move up and down with the cloak, making a really loud screaming effect with haunted house background noises. Well, this got put up in the office. It had a really weak sensor in which you had to really make yourself look big and walk directly in front of it to set it off. Or so I thought. A week after it was put up, the nightly occurrences started. Around 3 a.m., this thing went off and woke me with such a start, thinking it was my mom checking on me. I turned over for a hug when I realized she wasn't there. No one was there, just this cheap Halloween prop going off. This scared me, but I forced myself to go back to sleep. In 3 hours, it went off again. And then again. And again. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, but this would happen every night at the same time on the dot. I tried telling my mom, but she wrote it off as a passing train triggering it when the house shook. Great, no one believes me. As time went on, other stuff started happening. I was seeing dark figures standing behind me in a mirror, even though when I would turn around, no one was there. There was scratching on the outside of the walls. The adults thought it was just possums or something, and seeing ghoulish people looking through the windows at night, even though it would be impossible at the height of the windows. Again, I tried telling my mom, but she just thought it was me having an overactive imagination, and me not being used to sleeping alone. The only comfort for me at the time was Oso, Dave's big, beautiful German Shepherd. He was only around 7 years old at the time, and was a big ball of love. Unfortunately, the grandmother disliked Oso, and had him locked up in the backyard. At night, if I heard him growling below a specific window, I would know not to look that way. Well, a few months of him living back there, he started getting sick and lethargic. We took him to the vet, but they couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. They just thought he was getting old, and one day, a month later, we found him dead under the living room window, as well as the pheasant that Dave kept. He tried getting a chameleon, which a week later they found dead in his cage too, so that was the end of all the pets in the house. I started to notice that most of the bedroom windows were covered up with newspapers, which was odd to me. Dave's brother told me that it was to keep the morning light from getting in, but all the bedroom windows were on the west side of the house. 7 sleepless months went by, and my mom and Dave were fighting more and more, with every week getting worse than the last, even with the cops getting called at least once every 2 weeks. Those were the few nights I could actually sleep. Everything came to a terrifying head one night when the grandmother convinced Dave to take my mother out on a date, and they wouldn't be back until really late. It was around 11 p.m., and they had left 2 hours before. I had to go to the bathroom, so I walked to my grandmother's room, and then I noticed the light was off. There was nothing out of the usual, but I had become very wary of the dark because nothing ever good happened in the dark at this place, which is why I usually headed to bed right when the sun started to set if I could help it. But tonight I wanted to see my mother off on her date, and then we watched a Disney movie on TV. Not wanting to have to go all the way to the other side of the bathroom alone in the dark just to turn on the light, I went to back up to leave. That's when I backed up into the grandmother who was standing right behind me. She said some stuff in Spanish, then ended up with a grin saying,
¿Tienes miedo?
That night I learned it meant, "Are you afraid?" I told her I was going back to bed, but she shook her head and grabbed me and pushed me into the dark bathroom, shutting me behind the door and then latching it shut. I started crying and banging on the door as hard as I could, screaming for her to let me out. All I could hear was her chuckling softly on the other side of the door like this amused her in some sick way. It had been about 5 minutes of me sobbing and screaming bloody murder at her to let me out, and that's when I heard it. Click. It sounded like large dog nails or claws on the linoleum along the weight of something very heavy taking a step onto the old floor. I froze, still facing the door. Another few footsteps came closer to me in a faint growl. My heart went into my throat, and I couldn't even mutter a sound as I heard this thing teasingly stepping closer to me from across the bathroom. It was tall, considering the growl sounded like it was close to the ceiling. Tears were streaming down my face, but I could not get myself to move a muscle. The feeling of dread had filled the air. The temperature was so cold that I could see my short, raspy breaths in front of me. Imagine a Dementor from Harry Potter in a bad mood. That's what it felt like. Like all of the happiness and hope in the world was gone, and in my 8-year-old mind I was going to die there. Click, click, creak. It kept coming closer, but it was taking its sweet time. I literally could feel its eyes on me from behind and its enjoyment of what it was doing to me. As it got within a few feet of me, the noises stopped. I waited there for what seemed like an eternity. Then I could feel its burning hot breath on the back of my neck. This thing was right behind me. It was pressed against me and was grabbing my shoulders with these clawed hands, and as it leaned in and laughed in my ear and in my head with a very deep and gravelly voice, it just kept laughing on the outside but whispered incoherent things in my mind. That's when I lost it. My body and mind couldn't take any more of it, and I passed out. I awoke on the couch with a start as my mom and Dave opened the front door and walked in from their night out. I started crying as the memories of what had happened flooded back into my mind. My mother held me and tried to calm me down, as tired as she was. She tried to tell me that it was just a nightmare, but I was too hysterical to be reasoned with. I pointed and cried at the grandmother who had come out to see what the commotion was. I tried to tell them what had happened, but the grandmother acted confused. She said she had no idea what was going on, but I saw in her eyes that she sure as hell knew what the fuck was going on. I was too distraught with to be left alone again. My mother slept with me on the couch that night and opted me to get a cot to sleep in her and Dave's bedroom next to my sister's crib. I didn't sleep for another 6 months unless my mother was next to me until I fell asleep. 6 months later, my mother finally picked me up, packed up my things with my sister, and left Dave in the middle of the night, but again, as I mentioned, that's another story. A year later, my mother took Dave back for another 7 months, but we lived with other relatives this time. Dave's aunt, we'll call her Aunt Yaz, was one of the only people who stood up for me, along with her 2 sons, and was talking with me one day at her house while she was babysitting me and my sister. I came clean about the people that I saw in the windows at the grandmother's house. She turned pale, and then told me about when Dave was little he would run around her house crying that there were strange people he didn't know levitating and staring at him in his mother's room, along with the figures in the windows and the mirrors. They tried to have the house blessed countless times, but nothing ever happened, and they just learned to live with the strange happenings. I didn't tell her about the incident in the bathroom, or anyone until I met my wife. My wife is the only one who knows this story, until now, that you know, and the many other paranormal run-ins throughout my life have remained with me and not with anyone else. I have anxiety now, and I still have nightmares about the events of that house and that horrid woman. I'll wake up crying once in a while, and my wife will have to calm me down. My sister, thank God, has no recollection of these events, and neither does my mother. It's now 2016. I'm 23, and I still cannot be alone in the dark, or I will start having a panic attack. I cannot go to the bathroom by myself after the sun sets, and sometimes even during the day. Thanks, demon ex-grandma. I'm sharing this with the intent to share the story and let people know that there is evil and ill will in this world. But anyone who's going through it, I want to remind you, you aren't alone. And keeping it bottled up can have adverse effects on your psyche, So please find someone close to talk to about these things, even if it's sharing your story here. My cousin Joe. Although I've always been fascinated by ghost stories, I've never been terribly sensitive to the paranormal, to the point where I've been to places that are apparently haunted, but I have felt and seen nothing. However, after my cousin died in 2000, I had an experience that I remember vividly, and still affects me when I think about it. My cousin Joe died in a senseless car crash while out with friends. He was in the front passenger seat, and the crash happened when the driver decided to speed through a stop sign, causing them to collide with another car. My cousin hung on for about 24 hours, but finally the doctors told my aunt and uncle there was no hope. So they disconnected the wires and breathing machine, and my cousin passed on. Joe was gone and I was heartbroken. I was haunted by the fact that he was his parents' only child, while I'm the youngest of three, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it would have been more fair if I had died instead of him. After all, I thought to myself, I'm extra. If I died, my parents would still have 2 kids. My aunt and uncle have none. Then, one night in the fall of 2000, just a few months after his death, while I was in college, I had what I guess could be called a dream, but it was different from any other dream I've ever had before or since. And this is what I dreamt. I was in one of the common rooms in my dorm, and it was filled with random people. All of a sudden, I was drawn over to a window, and I looked outside. It was dark out, but right outside the window, I saw my cousin Joe. He was just floating next to a tree, looking in. I said, "Joe, what are you doing out there? I thought you died." And he said, "Yeah, I'm just hanging around." And then I remember saying, "Well, why are you out there? Why aren't you in here?" And he replied, "I can't come in unless you invite me." So I waved my arms and said, "Come in, Joe, come in." As soon as he came inside, I remember taking him aside and saying, "I'm so sorry for everything, Joe. I'm just so sorry." His reply was, "It's cool, man. I'm fine. Don't worry about me." Then he hugged me, and I can still remember vividly being pressed up against him, holding him close. I think that's when the dream ended. At first I didn't want to tell anyone. The dream was too precious to share. But finally I told my mother, and instead of brushing it aside the way I expected her to, she said, "Huh, that's interesting." She asked me if I minded if she told her sister, Joe's mom, and I said that I didn't mind as long as she didn't think it would hurt my aunt or anybody else to hear about it. My mom said that she thought my aunt would want to know, so I gave her the go-ahead. About half an hour later, my mom called me back and asked, "What was Joe wearing in the dream?" I thought for a moment and I answered, pretty simple stuff, a black t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers. Why?" There was a pause and my mom said, "Well, apparently that's exactly what he was wearing when he died." I hadn't seen Joe in a couple of years, so I had no idea what his clothing looked like, but somehow in my dream, I saw him in the same stuff he was wearing when that car had gotten crashed into. Joe never visited me again, though I've always hoped he would. I'm hoping that someday when it's my turn to go, that Joe will be able to meet me, and I'll be able to see him again. Something tells me he will be there. Crybaby Lane. Back in the late 50s and early 60s, there used to be an orphanage run by the Catholic Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. One horrible night, a fire broke out in the orphanage, taking several young children to their deaths. After the fire, the church decided to not rebuild, and after a period of time, all remnants of the orphanage were removed. Brush and weeds slowly took over the area. As the surrounding neighborhood began to develop, so did the tales of the fire. And they said on a quiet summer night, you could hear the whimpering and crying of babies. Years later, when I heard the story, a couple of friends tried to get me to go out to where the old orphanage stood on a quiet night. Now, that area is no longer the safest in Raleigh, and being more afraid of things that lurked in the night than things that go bump in the night, I declined, with the promise that we could go the following afternoon. Neither of us had ever been there before, so the next day we were off on our little adventure. We arrived at the site and followed a well-beaten path to where the old building once stood. Like I mentioned earlier, the property has been taken over with weeds and brush, but where the orphanage once stood was a bare spot about 100 feet across. No grass, weed, or bushes or anything. On the ground there were a couple of footprints that went a couple of feet into the spot, then doubled back. We also noticed a rabbit run out of the weeds and completely circle around the spot instead of crossing it. We circled the spot a couple of times, and none of us was too willing to go into it. So soon we all had the feeling that it would be best if we left, and we did. A few days later, my curiosity got the better of me, and off I went by myself to Crybaby Lane. I went down the path and determined I was going to walk across that bare spot. I hesitated a bit before stepping onto the barren ground and took a deep breath. Just a yard or so into it, I was overtaken by absolute silence. I mean, I couldn't hear the wind in the trees, I couldn't hear traffic from the nearby highway, nothing. I couldn't even hear my own heartbeat. But I was still stubborn enough to try to make it across. Once I reached the center, I stood still and listened. Just faintly, I could hear a crackling noise. It grew louder as the acrid scent of smoke hit my nose, and I stood there frozen, half in terror and half in amazement. Suddenly there was the shrill wail of an infant, and I ran. And no, not the rest of the way across. I doubled back and didn't stop running till I reached my car. It was a couple of years later when I gathered enough nerve to go back. But it was too late. As I made my way down the path, I saw bulldozers clearing the area for a new road. A road that I knew I would never drive down. Hello, Uncle Josh here. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed these true scary stories from around the world. If you are interested in having your story shared on the air, please email unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. In the subject line, please let me know the nature of your story. Also, remember to omit any real person's name that is involved in your story, and also send a short note of consent letting me know that I have your permission to share your story. Thanks again for listening. Stay tuned for more of Uncle Josh's true scary stories.